in the management of our natural resources. Especially noteworthy is his work with the Forest Service. The Secretary recently celebrated his 5th year as the Secretary of Agriculture. Mr. President, I'm sure you'll agree that during his tenure, the Secretary has been a true champion of protecting our nation's natural resources. On behalf of all Forest Service employees, I would like to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your extraordinary leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Dan Glickman, the Secretary of the United States Department of Agriculture.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Art, very much for that wonderful introduction. And I come from a very beautiful state of Kansas, but I mentioned to the President, this doesn't look like Kansas out here. But we have other things, too. So, in any event, I want to thank the President and salute him and the Vice President for their just extraordinary historic commitment to our America's natural resources and special places. I don't think anybody has done a better job ever. And I think there's the recognition that trees are not just beautiful, but also provide all sorts of protections for all of us, including providing and protecting wildlife habitat, capturing greenhouse gases, emitting clean oxygen, cooling the air, and help keeping our water clean for people not only in rural areas, but most of the urban and suburban areas around this country. They've been introduced before, but I want to reintroduce Undersecretary Jim Lyons, the Chief of the Forest Service, Mike Dombeck, who's done just an extraordinary job, Al Furlow of the Chief's office. They have really made a commitment, a national commitment to our national forests. These trees are just extraordinary. John Muir called them the noblest of God's trees, monarchs of the woods, an unrivaled display of combined grandeur and beauty. And John Muir also understands that without proper protection, these trees could eventually be lost. Only a handful of groves remain in the world, and all of them are right here on the western slope of the Sierra Nevadas. In addition, we've been told about how old these trees are. It's hard to imagine. The comedian George Burns once said that when I was young, the Dead Sea was still alive. Well, the fact of the matter is that these trees were the only things alive during the early part of our civilization in this world, and they are just a jewel historically as well as environmentally. So when the President asked me to examine the possibility of establishing a national monument to protect the sequoias, we gathered a team of career federal employees who consulted extensively with experts outside the federal government, local officials, tribal leaders, and the people who live in this area. Last week, I recommended to the President that a monument is the best way to ensure the sequoia's long-term survival. Monument status would provide permanent protection, not just to the trees themselves, but to the entire ecosystem on which they depend. And a new monument would also elevate the importance of these trees in the minds of the American people. My recommendation was based on the belief that the sequoias can be protected while ensuring continued public access and the use of the area. Current grazing and special use permits, like those for camps, for example, would remain valid, and the normal permit process would apply to their renewal. All pre-existing rights, including the access rights of private inholders, would be preserved. My recommendation also calls for a 2.5-year period during which the Forest Service would provide a transitional timber supply, utilizing commercial sales currently under contract and sales approved last year. We are also committed to using the full range of Forest Service and rural development economic assistance programs to help folks make any transition that may occur and to help and create new forest-related jobs, which we believe is very, very important. Ultimately, I believe a monument will be a net economic gain for this region, especially when you consider that recreation and tourism support the overwhelming number of jobs in our forests. In any event, these trees are special. Many of them predate the time Columbus came to this country, predate the Middle Ages, predate, in some cases, the Roman Empire, and predate, in some cases, many of the events that created the world's great religions. And so this is an opportunity of a lifetime for us to provide permanent protection of these most extraordinary assets this country has. So it is time to permanently protect giant sequoias now and to leave them for every subsequent generation to savor and admire. Now I want to introduce a very special guest, Marta Brown, wife of the late Representative George Brown, who I had the pleasure of working with in Congress for several years and serving on 2 committees in Congress. Marta worked side by side with him, not just as his spouse and partner, but as his press secretary as well. For Congressman George Brown, the protection of the giant sequoias was more than an issue. It was a crusade. When he passed away that last year, this forest, the San Bernardino Valley, and the whole nation lost a great leader. But Marta Brown has continued to carry on this crusade, and we are very honored to have her today. Marta Brown.
Thank you, Secretary Glickman. George considered you a very dear friend. He enjoyed his work with you in the Congress, and he would be very, very happy to be here today, if at all possible. On behalf of the Brown family, let me express our gratitude and pride in being here with you today. This is truly a historic event for us. It represents the culmination of George's lifelong dream to protect the sequoias. He fell in love with these trees the first time he saw them, and he knew that they needed to be protected. It's hard to think of a more important living national treasure than the sequoias. It doesn't matter how many times you see them, you still are overwhelmed by their presence. My husband was committed to the environmental effort. He spent his life committed to clean air, clean water, to protecting our natural resources, and of course devoted so much time and energy, as Secretary Glickman mentioned, to saving the sequoias and other old growth forests. The giant sequoias have proven that they can withstand the natural changes that occur over time. However, George was not confident that they would withstand economic and political changes without permanent protection under the law. The giant sequoia, which can live for longer than 4,000 years, represent more than a beautiful or unique living thing. It represents the continuity of the rich natural legacy that was left to us by our ancestors, and one that we must pass to future generations. It was George's intention to ensure that our generation was not the last one to experience the awe and wonder inspired by these trees. He would be pleased and proud that President Clinton and Vice President Gore shared his vision, and to know that he assisted in a small way to make this vision a reality. As a student of history, George Brown not only respected the grandeur of these trees, he understood their historical and educational value. He believed our planet was a natural classroom full of opportunities to learn. Therefore, the newly formed George Brown Foundation that we have established will develop programs that use natural resources, like the sequoias, as a basis for science education. Nature has given us a marvelous way to educate the leaders of tomorrow, future leaders like Alexander Reed Craze, who I will have the honor of introducing in a moment. But first, let me take a moment to thank President Clinton for demonstrating his commitment to preserving the great natural wonders of California through his commitment to conserving by having signed the California Desert Protection Act and by having worked to save the redwoods of the Headwaters Forest, and of course for being here today and helping us protect the sequoias. Now let me introduce Alexander Reed Craze, who is with us. He is an Eagle Scout from Springville. He is a student at Porterville High School. He has spent considerable time here in the forest. He has devoted himself to completing his Eagle Scout requirements, and in doing so has helped many of his fellow troop members complete many ecological studies here in the forest. And who knows, someday he may be here representing this area either as a member of Congress, or who knows, he might be another president in the making. Alexander?
My name is Alexander Reed Crace, and I'm an Eagle Scout. It is an honor to be here today and see the preservation of these giant sequoia trees, which have towered over the forest through the millenniums. I was 3 years old when I ventured out on my first overnight backpacking trip to Redwood Crossing in Sequoia National Forest. I hiked only 2 miles, but it was far enough for my father and I to camp beneath 250-foot-tall redwood trees. Sleeping below these giant trees that night and staring at patches of stars intermixed with the redwood boughs left an impression on my mind that I will never forget. I wanted to explore the forest and see the species of trees that has been here since the dinosaurs. Now, 14 years later, I've hiked over 1,000 miles in the Sierra Nevada mountains, with and without the Boy Scouts. Through the Boy Scouts, I have contributed to projects totaling in over 600 hours of labor to improve the forest and allow better access and conservation of these wonderful groves of redwood trees. I've spent many summer weekends in the forest learning to rock climb, hiking with friends and family, and during the winter months, learning to ski. The incredible size and dignity that these trees possess amazes me every time my eyes fall upon them. During my 9 years with the Boy Scouts, I've seen many kids be exposed to the giant sequoias for the first time, and every time the reaction is the same. Any trace of boredom or homesickness leaves their face, and they stare up at the trees with respect and amazement. They are always proud to be among the few people in the world who've had the honor to look upon these trees. They have the power to make people study and respect the world they live in. It is a great joy that I see these giant sequoias entering a national monument, and that they will be protected from mechanical human intervention so that generation upon generation of people will be able to enjoy them as extensively as I have. I'm grateful to witness this event and introduce to you the President of the United States of America, William Jefferson Clinton. Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Thank you and good morning. I think we should all be very grateful for the beautiful day we have. I know it was exciting that it snowed here last night, but I was watching Alexander give his fine remarks, and I was thinking that growing older has some merit, but one thing it doesn't have is the ability to withstand cold better. We took this whole walk, and there he is in his short sleeve shirt, and he never flinched, he never shivered, he just walked right on. I want to thank Alexander for his remarks and for his example and the work that he has done and the other young people he has exposed to this magnificent grove. I want to thank Secretary Glickman and Art Gaffrey. Secretary Glickman did a lot of work on this, and he talked about it in advance, and I'll say a few more words about it, but I appreciate it. Art told me he's been here almost 5 years now. And I want to thank Marta Brown, who is herself a remarkably devoted and accomplished public citizen. And I wish George were here with us today. I think he's smiling down on us, and I'm glad you could be a part of this. Thank you, Mike Dombeck and Jim Lyons, and I'd also like to thank my main environmental advisor, George Frampton, who runs our Council on Sustainable Development, Environmental Quality, for being here. And I'd like to thank the representatives of the Tule River Tribe who are here, who also cherish these great trees. Thank you for coming. About 100 years ago, Theodore Roosevelt dedicated America's first national monuments. He said he was doing it because we couldn't improve upon our native landscape. In his words, the ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. What you can do is keep it for your children and your children's children. Well, as we have already heard today, these giant sequoias clearly are the work of the ages. They grow taller than the Statue of Liberty, broader than a bus. They are the largest living things on this earth. So perfectly adapted to their environment that one has never been known to die of old age. And as has already been said, many we have seen today are more than 1,500 years old. They began when America was not even imagined and Europe was in the Dark Ages. Once these groves flourished all across the American West. Today they exist only here in the Sierras. Our second national park was created in 1890 to protect them. Yet half the remaining groves lie outside the national park. And although sequoias on federal lands are currently protected from logging, the environment around them must also be protected for the great trees to grow and reproduce. That is why we're here today. We're looking forward to the first Earth Day of the 21st century, and I think the best way to celebrate it is to designate the Trail of 100 Giants, more than 30 nearby sequoia groves, and the magnificent forest that surrounds them, the Giant Sequoia National Monument. Thank you. These lands will continue to be managed by the Forest Service as it once again embraces the conservation ethic that inspired its creation 95 years ago. More and more Americans are discovering our national forests as places to hike, camp, ride horses, enjoy a few hours of quiet contemplation. Years from now, Americans will come here to do all these things, and these majestic trees will continue, as John Muir said, to preach God's forestry fresh from heaven. I know there have been strong and sometimes conflicting views about the best way to manage these federal lands. Secretary Glickman recommended that they be protected after careful analysis and consultation with residents of the area, state, tribal, and local officials, and members of Congress. The Forest Service will work with the local community closely to develop a long-term plan. We want to ensure that all the interests are respected and that we help to bring jobs and opportunity to the area. This is not about locking lands up, it's about freeing them up for all Americans for all time. We're here because we recognize that these trees, though they live to be very old and grow very large, like life itself, are still fragile. The roots are surprisingly shallow, and the greatest threat to the tree's life is any disturbance to the tenuous balance between the tree and the ground that anchors it. 30 years ago next week, Americans celebrated the first Earth Day because they understood that we too have shallow roots on this planet and that our future depends upon balance among all living things. The story since then is a story of American progress to protect and preserve that balance. Since 1970, we've cleaned up many of our worst toxic waste sites and waterways, cut toxic factory emissions almost in half. The American people have made environmental protection part of their daily lives. They've demanded that government and industry act to protect our national treasures. I am profoundly grateful for the opportunities that Vice President Gore and I have had over this last 7 years and a few months to act as stewards of our environment. We have adopted the strongest air quality protections ever, improved the safety of our drinking water and food, cleaned up about 3 times as many toxic waste sites as the 2 previous administrations combined, helped to promote a new generation of fuel-efficient vehicles and vehicles that run on alternative fuels, launched new efforts to fight the sprawl that threatens so many of our quality of life. We've helped hundreds of communities to turn dangerous brownfields deserted by industry into safe, productive space. And yes, we have tried to protect a lot of our nation's precious treasures. It seems to me that these last 7 years should finally have put to rest the idea that you can't have a strong economy and a cleaner, safer, more balanced environment. And I hope we will never have that debate again. On this Earth Day, I would like to emphasize 3 things. First, obviously, this national monument. Second, what more we can do to preserve the most beautiful places in this country for all our children's future. We have a Lands Legacy initiative to protect green spaces from the most remote mountains to the nearest city park. This year, I've asked Congress to provide $1.4 billion to protect those special places, including nearby Dillonwood Grove, the last privately held grove of giant sequoias. I hope we get the money for that too. But the thing I want all of you to understand is that if this fund passes, most of the money will go to states and communities to help them pursue their own conservation priorities, including communities here in California. It will empower people all across America to protect those things that are most dear to them close at hand on a permanent basis. I'm happy to report that there's strong bipartisan support for this. We had a great meeting last week at the White House with Republican and Democratic congressional leaders, and I think we've got a good chance to build the Lands Legacy Initiative this year. Second, we need to invest in the future of our environment, not just at home but around the world. Tropical forests, where a lot of us would like to be right now. Tropical forests are home to more than half the known species on Earth. Yet they're being lost at the rate, now think about this, we came here to save these trees. Tropical forests, the home of many indigenous peoples as well, are being lost at the rate of 50 acres a minute. This year I have proposed a Greening the Globe initiative to help developing countries protect their endangered forests and better manage their natural heritage. And all these efforts to preserve biodiversity are important, but the last point I'd like to make is they won't do much good if I get killed by this falling ice. They won't do much good unless we band together to meet the greatest environmental challenge of the new century, climate change and global warming. The 1990s were the hottest decade on record. Scientists say that the temperature rise is at least partly due to human activity, and that if unchecked, climate change will result in more storms and floods, more economic disruptions, more permanent flooding of coastal areas, perhaps the entire flooding of island nations, and more threats to unique habitats such as the one in which we are today. So the last point I want to make is I hope all of you will help us to build a national consensus to cut down our emissions of greenhouse gases and to work with others around the world to use existing technologies to help them do the same. I urge those in Congress who have opposed our efforts to drop their opposition, to recognize that we now have the technology, and we will soon have much more, to cut emissions while continuing to grow the economy. For example, we have the technology to reduce by 85% the amount of energy it takes to run a refrigerator. We will soon have cars on the street that routinely get more than 60 miles a gallon, and new technologies such as fuel cells and biofuels to give us the equivalent of hundreds of miles from every gallon of gasoline. Just by changing the lights in the White House, I cut the power bills $100,000 a year. And we put in a new heating system, a more fuel-efficient roofing system. If the changes we made in the White House were made in every federal building, which I'm trying to get done, we would take the equivalent, we would reduce greenhouse gases so much it would be the equivalent of taking 1.7 million cars a year off the road. Now, these things are out there now. They will generate jobs. They will generate economic activity. And it is profoundly important that all of us who think about these things continue to talk to our friends and neighbors until we build a vast national consensus for concerted action. Now, I've asked Congress for over $2 billion for this, to fund local, national, and international efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, to fund clean technologies, to provide tax incentives for those who produce and those who purchase these kinds of products. Now, before I sign the proclamation, let me just remind you that for over 100 years, beginning with the residents of Visalia, California, Americans have fought to save these giant sequoias. Earth Day brought groups of Americans together on a crusade to save the treasures of our planet. Today, let's remember, even here on the Trail of 100 Giants, the global village presses even closer upon us. We have to look within our communities and beyond our borders for allies to deal with our common environmental challenges. We're doing our part today to make sure that the monarchs will be here after we're long gone, rooted strong in the web of nature that sustains us all. It has been a great honor for me to be here. I thank all of you who have supported these decisions. I thank you again, Secretary Glickman. But I ask you, when you walk out of here today, remember that not every person can come to this gorgeous giant grove, but every person can benefit from our continued efforts to improve our environment and sustain our natural heritage. And we still have a very great deal to do. Thank you very much. I'm going to have a hard time making a case for global warming today. But I decided to try anyway. Great. We're adjourned. Stand up. Relax.
Can you say at least? Can you not date it more precisely? Or?
We can, and they go up from 1500 to around, the oldest we've dated is 3,200 years old with the University of Arizona. But we take...
They were?
Yeah,
just
lightning
natural
fire. Yeah, and then another...
They survived remarkably, don't they?
They do. And a couple other trees will show you the see where the burn was.
Wish I could spend the day here. Have to get warmer pants.
Come back in two, and then we'll...
Love it. Gosh, I love this. I was, when I was a young man, I came out.
This fellow,
needs to get ahead to get out of the picture, please go with Terry right now.
Follow Gus second.
Follow Gus.
Yeah.
Should I stand right here?
Well attended.
Talk on.
Yes, we have. The uses and one of the things I'm trying to look at was really fun the months here to get some wins, get those camps or permits, get the fuel, and get the naysayers done.
Right. Take care of that.
Okay, I'm up here, Mr. President. Around here, we'll show you what we're looking at here. You asked about fire.
Yeah.
We're going to come down here. We're going to show you some area in here. And if you come around just a little more, you'll see actually, if you look up, this is actually 3 trees that have started together, and then they have grown, and the fire has separated them in the middle. Yeah. Well, sir, could you?
So the fire burned in the middle.
Yes.
The trees all lived anyway.
And what I'd like to show you, President, how about how big you think the seeds are starting?
That's great. Look how little the seeds are.
I got another.
Now, these won't grow back in Washington like that.
No, but we'd like to have you have a seed when you show the first one. And it's yourself and the seeds that started.
I talked to her late last night. She's so jealous of me being here.
They're going to lose it, but they come up. Kind of come around, and we'll show you where the fire off a little bit from there. But look at just 3 individual trees. Probably lived together now 1,000 to 1,500 years in there. And the other thing that's interesting is notice the meadow. Can you imagine the water that this thing pumps and needs to drink? So typically, the giants, you'll find some type of meadow in the area. They need an incredible source of water to exist in.
Mr. President, critics say this might actually cost timber jobs and recreation in the area. Do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I'll say make a statement up there.
I do. That one's a little immature. It isn't quite open, but it drops, and it drops the seed out in here. And plants the trees. Yeah, and that's what starts this big.
They're dropping too.
They are dropping.
How old are you? Sir, how old is this particular tree?
1,500 years at least.
At least 1,500.
Yeah. Now you've moved my code, folks. Doggone it. I moved my code. That's okay. That's all right. You doing okay? Mr. President, here's a sugar pine. Look how big this cone is. Now this is the cone for this tree, which doesn't get anywhere near as big or as old. But surely the size doesn't define the size of its tree, does it?
No. Quite a nice sized tree though, much bigger than the pine that I'm used to.
Yeah.
The ponderosa and the sugar pine are much bigger than the now. These are all cut.
They were cut for the safety reasons again. The eagles all make their homes. Like this is a good one, Mr. President. Look at the limbs off this rotten tree. Yeah. The birds are going to land on that. They'll dig a hole in it and start there. And when that hole gets larger, another animal will walk up, maybe a weasel or a raccoon, and then they'll make its home. And just go that way until it's too rotten, and then it's.
You remember Marta, Brand? They're just watching the program. Basically, we're going to go through the announcement on the stage. There's a beautiful giant sequoia there. We're going to walk through, actually.